Peace and love, everybody. Peace and love. This is your brother Garfield, and it's another episode of Scholar for Scholars 20 for 20. And today is number 18. It's Professor Dr. Jonathan Schorsch. He's a gentleman who wrote The Jews and Blacks in the Modern World. And I want to introduce him to the conscious community, but also to the Dagger Squad research community. And I want to say first and foremost, good afternoon. How are you, sir?
Good afternoon. Very well, thanks. Pleasure to be here with you. Thanks for inviting me.
No problem. Before you ever went to school, we're going to go back in time a little bit. Who were some of the scholars you looked up to before you even went into school to even think about writing about this topic?
Well, before I went to school, I don't think I knew any scholars other than my father, who was a historian. But I grew up loving literature, so I read lots of literature in high school. So fiction was my sort of window to the world, much more than scholarship. I mean, I think scholarship was something that came, after high school, in college, after college, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. All right. So as far as your father being a historian, so that pretty much was your biggest influence of trying to look into history.
That definitely played a big role. The Jewish people are very historically minded, very historically oriented. A lot of the holidays are commemorating historical events. So I do think that probably just growing up in a very Jewish household, I mean, my father is and was a rabbi also. So, I think that also turned me to appreciating the knowledge of history, knowing where you come from, knowing your past. I mean, I grew up in the Bronx, but my father was born in Germany. He fled the Nazis in 1939 with his parents. So that whole family's from Germany. My mother's family is from Eastern Europe, sort of mixed, different Russian, Hungarian, Ukrainian, Eastern European Jewish background. So, I think even there too, being, a son of immigrants, in a certain sense, led me to appreciate history and the craziness of history, the complexity of history, what it can do to individuals, what it can do to families, what it can do to peoples. So, I mean, those were, and then growing up as an American, I mean, just learning about, this country, the United States, watching, I don't know if you know the musical 1776, it's kind of old fashioned. Hamilton has kind of pushed it out now. In fact, my kids won't even watch 1776 because compared to Hamilton, it's so old fashioned looking. But, it's this wonderful older musical about the signing of the Declaration of Independence and Franklin and Jefferson and everyone. So, all of that kind of informed me about things. I remember I went to a modern Orthodox yeshiva, kind of Jewish day school until 8th grade. And I remember in 7th grade, I think it was, we were assigned Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, very famous D. Brown, if I'm remembering correctly, very famous treatment of the whole conflict at Wounded Knee, Custer, etc. And that I was so moved by that. I was so profoundly shaped by that. So, history is all over the place.
All right. So looking at what you're specializing with the Sephardic, the Lancados, the Luso-Africans, that time period, so forth, what made you get into that particular time period instead of going back to like the Babylonian time period or even the Persian time period or the Parthian time period or the Roman time period? What made you choose this particular time period?
So I basically got into my area of research, after college, so graduate school. By then, as I said, I had grown up in the Bronx. I had been a musician for a while. I played guitar. I did drumming. I did Afro-Haitian drumming for a while. I was very interested in different forms of Black music, everything from Parliament Funkadelic to reggae and African music, Fela, et cetera, et cetera. And in the 80s and 90s, particularly in the 90s when I was in graduate school, I think that those decades were the peak of a certain kind of Black Jewish animosity, very focused on issues such as the curse of Ham and the accusation that Jews were behind the slave trade or even solely responsible for it. So, you know, all of these voices, Khalid Muhammad, and among others, sort of the rise of Afrocentricity. So I was being someone who loved and had affection for and was fascinated by both Jewish and African American or African diasporic cultures. I was very saddened by that debate and the vitriol that went back and forth, and also sort of disappointed by the Jewish response. And so that was sort of my motivation for digging deeper into it. And what I came to understand was, at the time, again, the mid 1990s, even the best research on these topics, relations between Jews and Blacks in the medieval world, in the early modern world, and in the modern world, even the best research that had left so much untouched, and there was so much that people were merely guessing at and kind of taking stabs in the dark to try to understand. And I felt like it was just calling to be done right, which was an enormous undertaking, probably much much more ambitious than I should have, a much more ambitious topic than I should have chosen for my dissertation, because even just the language requirements were incredible, you know, Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, etc. So Hebrew, you know, etc. So but I felt like someone had to really try to go to the archives and look at the sources, look at the documentation, look at the evidence, and be able to say much more accurately, or at least try to do so, what had really been going on. And so I tried to step into that gap and stop, you know, put a stop to a lot of the speculations and say, look, here's what we know. You can interpret it how you want, but here's what we know. So,
You know, I've literally done a 20 for 20 scholars. You're number 80 now. And we had Dr. Daniel Fleming on,
mm-hmm.
Dr. Andrew Tobolowsky, he's a new guy on the scene, Dr. Josh Bowen. We got a lot of doctors, Dr. Bart Ehrman to deal with the New Testament, Dr. Richard Carrier was on last Monday. We've had a lot of scholars. And you know what I've realized? I've realized that I never really understood the Bible the way I think I do. I think I'm at another gear now because of the scholars that are on.
Cool.
And the reason why I say that is I don't take a lot of the things that a believer would take literal. I look at it more from a scholastic point of view, as far as literature, literary tropes, the genre it was written in, and so forth, the writing styles and the periods the books were written in. So it kind of helps me to understand the context of what the writers of the Bible were doing at certain time periods. So it helped me to understand more. Now, you being a scholar of the modern world, as far as after like 1300 AD, CE, and so forth, we have people that are called the Lancados. We have these terms, the Marranos, New Christians, Luso-African. We have the Lawanga Jews that's coming out now with Tadar Parfit. And it seems like African Americans, because of our identity crisis, want to attach ourselves to the Bible, but not only just the Bible, to the ancient Israelites written about in the Bible, not from a historical perspective, but from a theological, biblical perspective. My problem is, I don't see it. Maybe you can enlighten me and let me see it better with better vision. But do you ever see the New Christians, Marranos, Lancados, Luso-Africans, all the Jewish communities in West Africa, the Taout community, Timbuktu, Loango? Do you ever see any of those people coming over on a slave ship as a slave? That's the most important question of this interview. And by the way, I'm going to be monotonous and ask you this question again at the end. But just for those who are watching now live, do you ever see any of those people as slaves on slave ships?
Yeah, not really. I mean, we have to remember, right, all these terms, which are very complicated. I mean, all this history is very complicated, which makes it hopefully fascinating, but it makes it difficult to figure out what to make of it, how to interpret it. So, right, the new Christians, right, are the forcibly converted Jews, right, forced to convert to Catholicism, or maybe they converted out of social pressure, right, voluntarily. The Marranos refers to new Christians who are secretly very loyal to Judaism, right? They're secretly keeping their Jewishness ritually, religiously, or maybe just in terms of ethnic identity. The lançados, which is a Portuguese term, which it's not, people aren't sure exactly where it comes from. It may be related to being like thrown out or being in advance of the Portuguese. So the lançados were all of these Portuguese who came to West Africa and intermarried with local women, got involved with local trade, including with the slave trade, and they were kind of the intermediaries. They sort of were the go-betweens between the Africans and the Portuguese. And that the same term for Luso-Africans, right? The children of these relationships, the later generations, right? There were a few open Jewish communities in West Africa in places like Rufisque, in what's called Senegambia. There were 3 different communities that were very short-lived. They were very small in the 17th century, maybe the late 16th century. Very small, meaning like literally 30 people, maybe 50 people. So most of the Portuguese new Christians who came to West Africa were settlers, right? They were merchants. A certain number of them, we really don't know the numbers, we don't know the percentages, were involved with the slave trade, along with, indigenous Africans, by the way, making it even messier. I don't recall any case of a slave coming to the Americas on Portuguese boats, Spanish boats, Dutch boats later, English boats later. I don't recall any slave who claims to be Jewish. I don't recall any new Christians who come over as slaves. The first case I can think of is, Equiano, Olaudo Equiano, who's of course much later in the 18th century, who claims he's Igbo, and he, therefore he comes from he comes from Jewish community, may be Jewish. It's not exactly clear what he's claiming in his amazing memoir. As I was saying to you the other day when we talked, I mean, there are slaves who come over who are Jewish in one form or another. So I gave you the example of a woman I wrote about named Esperanza Rodriguez, who was born in Seville, the daughter of a new Christian man and an African woman who had been a slave. Her mother had been a slave already in Seville, Sevilla in Spain. And Esperanza ends up in Mexico, and she's part of this new Christian community there. She ends up being arrested by the Inquisition. She seems to be, if one can believe all the Inquisition documentation about the case, she seems to be a Marrano, very loyal to Judaism. And she's a fascinating example of African slaves, or I prefer to call them Afro-Iberian slaves, who Afro-Iberian enslaved people who are involved with the Jewish community there, or the crypto-Jewish community, or the new Christian community. But yeah. So I mean, the basic answer to your question is no. So in other words, the Portuguese, the new Christians, the Jews were not the slaves. Now, I know it's already complicated because of what I just said. I just gave an example of Esperanza Rodriguez, who was a slave. So she gets us to another question which you asked, which I don't want to determine what the sequence of the conversation is, but when we get to that, I can explain, a little bit maybe more clearly about that, what happens in the 16th and 17th centuries between Sephardic Jews, Portuguese New Christians, and West Africans, and hopefully maybe clarify some of what's going on here.
This is something I never got to talk to you about, but have you read the article by Tudor Parfit, the recent one in the Slate magazine? It came out like a week ago.
What's it called?
Are the Jews Black?
Okay, good title.
He breaks down, I think this is probably one of the best articles I've ever read in my life. It is like mind-boggling how great of an article this is. I'm like, why didn't he put this out years ago? But he talks about how how the Jews were determined to be Black. And it was based on this German guy who used the whole thing. If you have blonde hair, you're more to be white, you're considered white, but your complexion, how you are and how you look, if you had dark hair, you'd be considered Negroid. So Hitler called the Jews Negroid in a way to put them down, not to say that they were my complexion. And I think my community are taking words like from Hitler, out of all people in the world, Hitler, to say, hey, you see, even Hitler know we the true Hebrews. They were Negroid. So what do you feel about that?
Right. So Parfit is, has been doing a lot of amazing work on these areas. And I mean, the reason I think he hasn't put this out earlier is because he's learning all of this stuff as he goes along. So he's talking about a much later period, which is really the 19th century and the era of scientific racism. But the same process, the same phenomenon can be seen much earlier. And that's what I wrote about. We have to remember that these terms like race, these terms like identity are so flexible, and you can fill them with whatever you want. You can make them mean all kinds of different things. So I think it's pretty obvious to me, I know you had this again listed as a different question, we can get back to it, that if you look historically at the biblical period, rabbinic period, the medieval period, the Jews who are writing those texts consider themselves between black and white, just as a question of skin color. They talk about the Germans, these Teutonic tribes, as being white. They talk about Cushites, Cushim, Ethiopians, which was a kind of general term for Africa, as being black. They saw themselves as being somewhere in the middle. And the Talmud has repeated discussions of this exact question. And that was true of almost all Mediterranean peoples. You see the same thing among the Greeks and the Romans. They were very proud that they were kind of healthily balanced. They weren't too white, they weren't too black. And they compare the rabbis, for instance, in the Talmud, compare Jews, the color of Jews, to boxwood, which is a kind of, nice, light brown, yellow, medium brown, right? So in terms of skin color, the Jews themselves in the rabbinic period considered themselves Mediterraneans, basically. So it's all subjective. What do you want to call it? Do you want to call it swarthy? You want to call it olive? You want to call it light brown? I don't know. I mean, you can pick your terms. But that is completely separate from the question of blackness as a cultural thing, or blackness as an identity thing, meaning Africanness. And even that term, Africanness, obviously is misused, because North Africans, that's not what people mean when they talk about Africanness, right? Afrocentrics mean sub-Saharan Africans, even though, they start from ancient Egypt, but fine. So when it comes to blackness, I mean, there's so much evidence, I'm happy to get into it with you, that until, let's say, the 15th century, 16th century, 17th century, that the Jews are not African. Now, again, we have to be very, very careful, because obviously there are Jewish groups, there are Israelite groups, Judean groups that flee, that go into the diaspora, that go to North Africa. And yes, I'm sure there are Jewish groups who lived in Timbuktu, who, by the way, were wiped out in the 15th century because of a Islamist, very extremist Islamist wave that destroyed the Jewish community there. But no doubt there were Jewish communities in Berber territories across North Africa, etc. Were there Jewish communities in sub-Saharan Africa? Probably. I don't know that there's much evidence that's solid from a scholarly point of view, but I've no doubt that there were Jews and maybe even Jewish communities down there. But the majority of European Jews are Mediterranean, and then, moving into Europe, intermarrying with Europeans, both the Sephardim, the Spanish Portuguese Jews, and the Ashkenazic Jews. What happens is, in my opinion, is Europeans start to look at Jews, and for the exact same reason you said before, in order to insult Jews, in order to knock them down, in order to keep them separate from us good white Europeans, they were called black. But it didn't mean they were Negroid, a term that I can't stand, but fine. I mean, it didn't mean they were African. It meant that their somewhat darker skin color was just another reason to distinguish them from, again, we good white Europeans, especially in Northwest Europe, in Holland, France, England, etc. You don't really see Spaniards and Portuguese Christians calling Jews black, because Spanish and Portuguese Christians were also swarthy and Mediterranean and probably didn't look so different from the Jews. So I think that from the medieval period on, blackness is a kind of insult and form of othering for Jews. Then what happens is, when the Portuguese Jews do go to West Africa, and in the 16th and 17th centuries, and start settling there, intermarrying with local women so that they can, establish trade privileges, marrying the daughters of the chieftains or the kings. And then they start to have kids, mixed race kids, right? Luso-African kids. And then when they come back to Europe, then you have a lot of these new Christians or Jews who are literally mixed Jewish and African. And then, yes, they are very much African and black, or mulatto, or mixed race, depending on whatever terms, many of them, of course, racist terms or racialist terms. Then, yes, then you do have a subset of the Jewish population that is indeed sub-Saharan African plus Jewish, and that is a fascinating story. And then to add to that, once you get the Sephardic Jews as slave owners in the Americas, in places like Suriname, Jamaica, where you come from, Curacao, Barbados, etc., or Dutch Brazil in the 17th century, there too you have a coming together of Jews and blacks. And I don't mean by coming together that it's wonderful and harmonious. It's probably much the opposite. That the Afro-Iberians were the slaves who belonged to Jews, to Jewish owners, not necessarily in plantations. A lot of the Jewish owners were just merchants who may have owned 1 or 4 slaves to help with domestic chores, but it was still slavery. Perhaps it was less horrendous than plantation slavery.
One interruption I need for that point you're making.
Okay.
When the owners had helpers, or in Jamaica we call them helpers too. So you had 4 helpers. Wasn't those helpers converting to Judaism?
Okay, great.
Help them to get out of being slaves.
So exactly. So great. So that's where I was getting to. Great question. So in these places, these colonies in the Americas, you have Jews owning slaves, and the slaves are made Jewish to some degree or other. Here too, fascinating story, complex story. Some of the slaves were converted. Some of them converted voluntarily. From my research, I have concluded that the overwhelming majority of the slaves who converted were so-called house slaves, domestic slaves, urban slaves, not the so-called field slaves.
We use a different term, of course. We use the N-word. We call it the house N-word, and so we know what you're talking about. Go ahead.
Okay. Right, that's your prerogative. I won't say that. So And the reasons are obvious, right? That the house slaves are closer to the masters. They're living in a much more intimate situation with them. Because they tended to be lighter skinned, because the lighter skinned enslaved people were favored by the masters, so and therefore they were considered more attractive in some ways. So there were often more relationships, whether rape or romantic, between the masters and the enslaved people. So you have many converts to Judaism. Whether they were really halachically converted, that is according to Jewish law, or not, is a whole other question. But yes, you have many, many slaves converted to Judaism. And so again, that's why I say that's a whole new wave now in the 17th and 18th century, where you have truly, African peoples and individuals who are entering the Jewish community. It's not a harmonious entry. There, in many respects, even the converts, even though they're Jewish, are not fully accepted. There's a lot of racialist legislation that's passed in the Jewish communities, the Sephardic communities, and even in Amsterdam, but in Suriname and Curacao, etc., where that keeps these non-white Jews out of full participation in the community. So it's a messy history. Even though they're in the community, it's like one scholar, Aviva Ben-Or, calls it peripheral inclusion, which I think is a nice term. They're included, but they're still considered outsiders. So, like laws or ordinances, for instance, that even Jewish non-white Jews in Suriname, for instance, in the synagogue could only sit on a certain bench that was sort of in the back, because they didn't want to have them be too visible, I think. They didn't want to be like seated in respectable, seats. Even in Amsterdam and Suriname, the non-white Jews were not. There were ordinances passed that the non-white Jews couldn't be given honorific ritual, sort of ritual honors in the synagogue. There was even an ordinance passed in Amsterdam in the 1640s that people should not circumcise their non-white Jews at all, which tells us, one, that some of the Sephardic Jews were in fact circumcising their male servants or slaves, but also that the white elites in the community didn't like that. So, as always with these topics of race and slavery in this colonial period, you have this double face. You include them because you need their labor and you need their help, but you exclude them because you don't really want them to be like you. You don't really want them in your community. So I don't know, hopefully that's a kind of good overview of.
All right. Let me ask this question real quick.
Yeah.
What determines if someone is a Jew or not, in your opinion? The reason I ask, Judaism, let's say 5th century BC, compared to now, wouldn't be the same based on it being more of a temple-based religion compared to it being more of a book-based religion, more like rabbinical Judaism.
Right.
What? Mm-hmm.
Wow, small question. Well, let's forget the biblical period, because the truth is the biblical period is super complicated. The rabbis basically form what we know as Judaism. The biblical period is not even Judaism. I would call it Israelite religion. It's really a whole different thing. It's a whole different ballgame. Once the rabbis kind of take over, and I don't mean that in any nefarious sense, but once the rabbis remake Judaism, what determines whether you're Jew is whether you're born to a Jewish mother, whether as a male you're circumcised, whether as a woman you're keeping the laws, right, immersing yourself ritually after menstruation. If you're an outsider and you come into the community, if you're a convert, then there too, as a woman, you have to do a ritual immersion, and that is part of your conversion. As a male, you have to do a ritual immersion, a mikveh, a bath, right, and then also be circumcised. Now, there is a kind of partial status what's called a ger toshav, a kind of resident alien, which is a biblical term. And so there is a sense that in Europe, and let's just stick to Europe, and let's keep in mind that Jews lived in Europe from Roman times. So, Jews are in Germany and Spain and in Italy from before the first century, even from the first century, certainly from the second century in the Common Era. So in those places, there are non-Jews who are involved to some degree or other with the Jewish community. Maybe they're servants in a Jewish household. Maybe they're doing certain kind of tasks or helping, or maybe they work very closely with the Jews, as butchers, as tailors, as whatever. But they wouldn't be considered Jews. So I think there's a pretty clear distinction, from a Jewish perspective. You're either Jewish or you're not. As I mentioned to you when we were talking the other week, we do have evidence of slaves who converted to Judaism before the Atlantic slave trade. So let's say the 13th century, 14th century, 15th century, before the Atlantic slave trade was really like getting up and running in an industrial sense. And we have documents from Italy in particular, from other parts of the Mediterranean, where questions are asked of a rabbi about, let's say, a slave, and it's specified in the document. This slave woman is a Cushite woman, meaning, i.e., she's an African, she's black, and she, let's say, her master converted her, but she was never freed, right? And which means you actually, they have to be freed to be fully Jewish, right? Or she was never freed ritually, legally from a Jewish perspective. Therefore, she's still a slave. So what's her status? Is she Jewish or not? Can she marry a Jew? Can she marry a member of the Jewish community? So that's just one example. And there we have several examples, a handful of examples of Africans who are slaves in the Jewish community and end up, to some degree or other, migrating into the Jewish community, marrying, intermarrying, being freed by their masters, and becoming part of the Jewish community. And we know, for instance, in Egypt, in the medieval period, that the Fustat, what becomes modern day Cairo, the slave market in Fustat was basically mostly supplied from Sudan, from south of
so-called Nubia.
Exactly, from where the origins of the Nile. So we had all these, sub-Saharan Africans coming up and as slaves, some of whom were bought by the Jews who lived in Egypt at the time. Now there you do have a very interesting document from the, I want to say 16th century, could be 15th century, but I think it's 16th century, of a slave who's bought. This goes back to your first question, of a Jew who asked one of the rabbis. He said, well, I bought this slave, and the slave says he's Jewish. He comes from the tribe of Dan, right? He's Ethiopian. What should I do? Do I have to free him? And there the rabbi says, and it's a very famous responsum, it's a very famous document.
About from the Eldad the Danite, or are you talking later?
No, this is much later. This is
okay.
Eldad the Danites, 9th century or something like that. This is 15th or 16th century, and it's and the rabbis say, well, yes, he's really Jewish. You have to free him. We don't really know the origins of the Jewish community there, but yes, they are. We have to consider them Jewish, whether they were quote unquote originally Jewish or not. And if you know anything about the history of the Ethiopian Jewish community, it actually is quite convoluted. So that's an example of from East Africa, mind you, not from West Africa, from East Africa, an example of a slave who claims Jewishness. And in this case, the Jewish master acknowledges that claim and says, okay, well, the rabbi says I have to free you. So that's what happens. So
you know what, Dr. Schorsch, one second. When you speak of rabbis and people talking about rabbis making decisions for Jews, right? The crazy thing is, these aren't African rabbis. These aren't quote unquote African American or African rabbis or black rabbis. These are Mediterranean rabbis, are descendants of them. But watch this though. They come from the rabbinical schools like the if I'm pronouncing it wrong, just correct me. You the doctor. Pombedetta or the Surah and
Very,
all these academies. I mean, my
very
community,
good.
they're not into that stuff. I'm into that stuff. But they come from all these academies, which is where the tradition is showing, even to the point where you have someone who's called the Exilarchete or whatever, where he's considered a descendant of Yekaniah when he went into Babylon and all this stuff. This is a tradition that's going on for years. It
Right.
don't include Africa. This is my point, though. It don't
Right,
include them.
Right. Now, first of all, you're very good. I'm very impressed. You know this stuff pretty well, so that's awesome. You know, it could be that some of these individuals were of African descent. We know from the Bible. Obviously, there were Ethiopian archers, Ethiopian soldiers in what we call Judea, in Palestine. So I'm not saying, I don't think anyone is saying that it's impossible that any of them were African. It's very possible, but it simply wasn't a question of identity. And the big question for me is, look, if these guys, even if they were, let's say all of these Jews, including the rabbis, let's say they were African, let's say they were Ethiopian originally. Mm-hmm. So if that's the case, then you can't argue that the Talmud was anti-black. That would be weird, right? If the Talmud is all about the curse of Ham, but they're all black, I mean, that would be strange. And then secondarily, if they're all black and African, why is it's never mentioned? Why is it they're not like proud of their blackness? Why is it they're not proud of their Africanness and talking about it? Why don't they talk about, you know, we have to go back to Africa or anything? You just don't see anything. So again, it may be that there are individuals who come from Africa, who intermarry, who become part of the community. That could explain, you know, partially why the Jews are darker than Northwestern Europeans. But as a community, as a collective, as a discourse, as an ideology, I don't see anything reflecting Africanness or blackness as an identity, right? And that, to me, is what the important question is. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so let me get back to some of these questions because we all over the place, which I like. I hope.
Sorry, that's what happens. For me, it's all connected. You know.
How long do I have you for today? I hope I have you for another hour.
Sure.
Don't give me the nudge. You give me the shoulder nudge. Okay. All right.
My pleasure.
The lost tribes of Israel. Is it a myth or real in your professional opinion?
Well, I don't like those. I don't like the distinction of the terms real and myth. Myths can be real, and reality can be pretty mythical. So, you know, okay. I would say, you know, and like all of the stuff you're asking me, you know, we're talking about such a wide range of topics here. My expertise is limited. There's so much I have not studied. There's so much that I've studied that I don't fully understand. So please, let's keep that in mind. Yes, I'm sure. I have no doubt that the tribes, when they were exiled by Nebuchadnezzar, you know, may have sustained collective identity, that they may have remained tribes and communities, you know, aware of their identity, aware of their past. It would not surprise me, again, as I said at the beginning, there's nothing stranger than history. It would not surprise me at all if these groups of the former tribes people remained cohesive for centuries, and if they ended up in all kinds of far-flung places, India, parts of Africa, parts of Arabia, you know, the Caucasus, the Caucasus Mountains, etc. I have no doubt that that's all possible. The questions for me are, one, do they retain a sense of their identity as former Jews and Israelites, which is not particularly clear. And we can give modern examples like the B'nai Menashe in India, of people who both claim Jewish background but sort of don't practice anything Jewish. So again, for me, a lot of the question here is self-awareness. If it's one thing to claim Jewish background, and it's another thing to live as a Jew, even if you're not living as a Jew fully, properly, or legally, you know. So that's the first question. Then the second question is, the myths about the lost 10 tribes include all kinds of fantastical elements. You know, the Sambatyon River, this mystical river that depending on the version, only flows on the Sabbath or stops flowing on the Sabbath and is keeping the lost tribes from all of the surrounding peoples, or ideas that the lost tribes were incredibly powerful and had all these soldiers and armies and were just waiting for the Messiah to come, and then they were going to sweep out and, reunite the Jewish people and reconquer the Holy Land and bring the Jews back to Zion, right? And then lastly, the myth that the lost 10 tribes were somehow, intimately connected with this messianic history, that they were kind of part of the eschatological, program, right? And so those last few elements are the ones I don't really buy. So in other words, yes, it's plausible, and it wouldn't even be surprising if there are groups of Jews out and about all over the world, former 10 tribesmen and women, and that may explain all kinds of different historical episodes we know about. But the idea that, they're this powerful, super powerful group with all these soldiers and arms, the idea that they're going to be part of the messianic story, that's the part that I'm not so sure about. And by the way, just the last thing I want to say about it is if you trace historically from Eldad, the Danite, if you trace all of the mentions of the lost 10 tribes by both Jewish authors and Christian authors, because the Christians also obviously became obsessed with this whole lost 10 tribes myth and Prester John. If you actually map them, which I did at one point in my book, I talk about it, you can see very clearly how the location of the lost 10 tribes moves from the Caucasus Mountains in Central Asia in the early medieval period, go increasingly westward as you get the Atlantic slave trade. As you get European overseas expansion, as you get European colonization of the Americas, of Africa and Asia. So you can actually see where people are imagining the lost 10 tribes to be. So the fact that the location of the lost 10 tribes keeps moving westward itself tells you that these myths serve a certain ideological purpose.
Okay, great. All right. Why do you believe African Americans are gravitating to a Jewish ancestral origin?
Wow. Okay.
You could say pass. You could say pass.
You're asking some small, simple questions here. It's like, no, I'm teasing. No, these are immense questions. Wow. You mean today? You mean today? Today. So I have to say, my answer to most questions is, and my belief as a scholar is that the answer to most questions is never just one single thing. As a historian, that's what you learn, that there are complex, multiple factors, and that there are multiple reasons for a lot of things. So going back to what we were talking about before, there are African Americans now, meaning in the sense of the United States. Maybe let's talk about the Caribbean too. There are African Americans who come from Jewish background, meaning, you come from Jamaica, so right there were Afro-Jamaicans, there were blacks in Jamaica who had either worked in Jewish households, who had been slaves in Jewish households, who either, again, converted voluntarily or were forcibly converted. Although Jews were not supposed to forcibly convert. So I'll leave that question aside. And so therefore they're Jewish. If you're converted, you're fully Jewish. I mean, once you're converted, you're in, right? All the racial stuff aside, but legally you are fully a Jew. So from Suriname too, there are many, Afro-Iberians, Afro-Dutch, Afro-Jamaicans, and Afro-Americans in the United States sense who come from Jewish background. Then you have a smaller number of African Americans who claim Jewish background from Africa, either from Ethiopian sources or Loango. There was a very famous case of this guy from the 1920s, who toured in the United States, and I'm forgetting his name right now. He wrote a book, fascinating story. I apologize that I'm forgetting his name. I can send it to you afterwards if you want. And he was kind of toured around the Jewish communities by Jewish sponsors because he was this example of an African Jew. I'm a little more skeptical of.
I think I know. I think, was he in Chicago? Was he based out of Chicago?
I don't think he was based in Chicago, but I do think he went through Chicago.
Was he found out to be fake or something like that? Because he was faking it?
It depends who you ask. There are some people there are some people who think he was fake. There are some people who think he was real. All these stories, again, it's all perspectival. It all depends who you ask. But in the 1920s, I'm sorry that maybe his name will come to me later. So I'm a little more skeptical of some of the African claims of Jewishness. Not because I don't believe there were groups of African Jews, but it's just more rare. And as you know, I think you've talked about, I've seen in some of your other episodes, you've talked about, what's his name, Williams, and this whole, the Hebrewisms of West Africa. Mm-hmm. So, we both know, I think we both agree that there's a lot of misuse of a lot of this mythical information. So I don't want to sound like I don't believe it, but I'm a little more skeptical. Okay, so those are the two of the origins. And then you have a lot of African Americans throughout the 20th century who have encountered Jews, especially after the Great Migration, when blacks moved northward into the urban centers, Detroit, Philadelphia, New York, et cetera, Boston, and start encountering Jews now for the first time for real, in real time in modernity. And I think they're both intrigued and put off. And I'm not going to get into the whole economic question and the question of, exploitation as landlords, et cetera, which is very real, of course. But I'm just talking about coming into contact with Judaism and Jewishness in the living sense on a much stronger numerical scale, a much stronger, much higher level demographically. And that's when you start to have the beginning of all of these fascinating syncretistic African-American religious communities like the Hebrew Israelites, like the Commandment Keepers of Harlem. It's really in the teens and the 1920s, maybe a little earlier, but probably not much earlier, that you start to have the first Black Jewish congregations and communities, as far as I know, that are self-consciously African and also self-consciously Jewish. And their Jewishness is kind of an interesting mixture of elements from both of those backgrounds. But I would say, I know that a lot of these commandment keepers and others, Hebrew Israelites, claim that they were Jewish in Africa. It's possible. I don't want to, who am I? I don't know all of this stuff inside out, of course. There's a lot I don't know, but I'm a little skeptical. I think a lot of them were simply turned on by it. First of all, let's say that Judaism is, of course, a beautiful, meaningful religious culture. So to begin with, there's that. We have to also keep in mind that most African Americans who grew up in the Protestant church were therefore brought up in a form of Christianity which was very Old Testament oriented. And I think because of that Old Testament orientation and because of the African American spin on Protestantism, Israelite identity and Jewishness was very attractive, very appealing. And the notion of the chosen people was, of course, very powerful for Blacks who, of course, had suffered miserably in servitude, in horrific servitude. So I think there's a lot of, and then another explanation or motivation might be that, the flip side of anti-Semitism, which is philo-Semitism, says that Jews are very wealthy and successful at business and a very successful minority that has managed to maintain identity and some form of autonomy for over 1,000 years. So there are, I think, a whole host of reasons that people coming from a troubled background with fragmented identity would be drawn to Jewishness and Judaism for both positive and negative reasons, if all of that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Could you explain the usage of the phrase Black in all sources for Iberian Jews? Why were Iberian Jews referred to as Black? This might be kind of repetitious from what you said earlier, but go into it anyway.
That's okay. No, it gives me a chance to maybe clarify a little more. So that's what I was talking about. in really the a little bit in the medieval period, but really you see it pick up in the 17th century in particular. Let's remember, right, the 16th, 17th centuries were the centuries where Europe had just colonized the Americas. It were the centuries where Europeans were now really starting to become familiar with Native Americans, were really numerically starting to use sub-Saharan Africans as slaves throughout the Americas in mass numbers. Europe is, of course, exploring Africa itself directly. This is the era of the rise of comparative ethnography. You have Europeans now thinking about other peoples, realizing that there are other cultures out there, and trying to figure out what to make of them. How do we relate to them? How come the Bible doesn't talk about them? All kinds of questions. And of course, the answers they came up with were both positive and negative. You have this whole myth of the noble savage, which is very positive in one sense. And then you have, of course, all the racist and racialist understandings of these other peoples. So whiteness becomes now important. If you look at the medieval world, whiteness didn't really mean anything. Whiteness was a class thing. Whiteness was for the nobility because they didn't have to work out in the fields and they didn't have to get burned by the sun. So women in particular were loved if they were white, their beautiful white breasts, which proved that they didn't have to do manual labor. And that's why that was part of their attractiveness, right? Because they were privileged. So whiteness really, I think, meant something class oriented. And it was a standard literary trope connected to that class usage. Now that Europe has discovered all these other peoples, and many of them have skins that are different hues, different colors, red, yellow, black, whatever bad color terms we want to use for them, whites are now being like, oh, wait a second, who are we in relationship to them, right? Once colonization starts taking effect, once African slavery or Atlantic world slavery starts taking effect, you have the Europeans in the Americas, in particular, in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, who come from Holland, Spain, Italy, all kinds of European countries. And what unites them in their privilege and power over the slave classes and the conquered classes becomes whiteness. So that's why I think that's when and why whiteness becomes so powerful and so appealing, right? And so then you have both Europeans, especially again in Northwest Europe, and Jews themselves trying to figure out where the Jews fit in. Now, the Jews always have played a very complicated role in Europe. In certain ways, Christianity marginalized them and denigrated them and demonized them horribly for theological reasons that we can go into, but that are very complicated. And Jews were really considered other, and Jews were massacred, forcibly converted, expelled, etc., treated horribly. On the other hand, Jews were also kind of insiders, because Jews came from the origin of Christianity, the Bible, the Hebrew Bible. Jews were part of us. They were also like us, the Christians said. So Jews were always in between. So I think when Europeans start using the terms black about Jews, on one level it's theological, right? Like Song of Songs 1:5, right? I am black but beautiful. So blackness becomes a theological marker of sin, of distance from God, and the Jews, as supposedly stubborn, blind, unbelievers in Christ, are seen as black in their theological distance from the truth. So in the medieval period, you see a number of authors who call Jews black, who see Jews as being black. You have a number of authors who use the trope of, from sort of twisted from Jeremiah of washing an Ethiopian clean, which becomes a massive kind of topos, a massive kind of meme in the medieval world. That it's fruitless to try and wash an Ethiopian because they'll always be black. And so Jews, the blackness of Jews was a sign of their stubbornness and their disbelief in Christ. And then what happens is, as I said, right, you have the Portuguese and Spanish Jews who are still Mediterranean and swarthy, olive-skinned. They're darker than, let's say, the Dutch or the English or the French, and certainly darker than the Scandinavians and the Germans, right? And they move into Northwest Europe, so they're seen as looking somewhat differently, right? Looking somewhat different. But it's really in the 17th century that this whole blackness of Jews comes to the surface, right? And now you have Jews called black, and it goes back to what I was saying. I think it's because of all of the intermarriages between Portuguese New Christians and African women in West Africa. And then when they come back to, let's say, to Amsterdam, when they come to northern France, when they come to England or the Americas, they're part of the Jewish community there. Whether fully accepted or not, it's another question, but they're parts of the Jewish community there, and they're marrying in and they're having children, and so they're in some sense darkening the look of some of these families. So that indeed the Portuguese Jews, because I think there was a statistically visible intermixture with African women, whether free or slave, and also slave women in Lisbon in particular, but in the Iberian Peninsula, it's likely that many Sephardic Jews were much darker now and maybe did have more African features. So that when these sources use the word black, that's what I think they're referring to, this combination of actual intermarriage that's fairly recent between Jews and Africans. Two, it's a theological form of sort of distancing and othering. And three, it's a way of saying the Jews they're not the worst, but they're not like us. They're sort of in between. Yeah. So some scholars use the term they're not fully white, right? Or other scholars use the term they're not yet white. So does that help a little bit?
Makes sense.
Maybe.
All right, let's get to a question that's relating to this. What relationship did the Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews have with one another during the Middle Ages going into the Enlightenment period?
The Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews, I mean, they had very close relationships. I mean, they were two, branches of Judaism, but they recognized each other. They were in constant interaction. They didn't really become self-consciously distinct until, I'd say the Middle Ages, the 13th century, 14th century maybe. But, there's interaction between the two. I mean, there's, the Sephardic Jews later on, when the Sephardic Jews, after the expulsion of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews from Spain, and then in Portugal, they're forcibly converted in 1497. They're expelled from Spain in 1492. And by the way, just for your listeners, and viewers, Sephardic Jew simply means Spanish Portuguese Jew. So that's all that it means. Ashkenazic Jew refers to the Jews of Central Europe and then later Eastern Europe. So when the Sephardic Jews are expelled from Spain and they flee Portugal later on, when they are able to, and they move into Ashkenazic territory, the Sephardic Jews are very haughty, very kind of separatist, and they have a lot of things against the Ashkenazic Jews. They're even in a lot of communities, Sephardic Jews were not allowed to marry Ashkenazic Jews. Ashkenazic Jews weren't allowed to be buried in Sephardic cemeteries. So there was definitely this kind of Sephardic superiority complex. But, I can't think of any case where the one group of Jews, the Sephardic or Ashkenazic Jews, didn't accept the other as Jewish, I mean, they were both fully aware of each other and accepting of each other as being branches of the Jewish world. So is that helpful?
Yeah, definitely. There are many hate groups who like to make outlandish claims against the ethnicity of Ashkenazi Jews. How does academia treat the question of the ethnicity of Ashkenazi Jews?
Right. Well, I mean, as far as I know, and again, I'm not expert in these topics, until the early Middle Ages, let's say again, 13th, 14th century, I don't think there's anyone who doubts, I don't think there's any scholar today who doubts that those Jews were descendants of the Mediterranean Jews, who were descendants of the Middle Eastern Jews. I mean, it's a pretty clear pattern where you have the Middle Eastern Jews from Babylonia and other Middle Eastern territories moving, but by the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries to Sicily, to Spain, and other, adding to the Jewish populations that were already there in Roman times. I think the main theory about that on which doubts about Ashkenazic Jews have been raised comes from this theory that's been pushed about the Jews from the Caucasus, about the so-called sorry, what?
The 13th tribe argument,
right? The Kazakh Jews, the Khazaria, and which was a theory pushed by Arthur Kessler among others. And I think that there definitely was. There seems to have been a Jewish kingdom, the Khazar kingdom. We know very little about it, although there's some amazing new archaeological research that's being done about it. We don't know if the population of that kingdom really was Jewish, or if it was just the nobility and the elites who had converted for whatever reasons of convenience to Judaism. And the reason that Kessler and others suggested that the Ashkenazic Jews derive from the Khazar Jews and they're not real Jews was because you have the rise in the 14th, but particularly the 15th century in Poland. You have this sudden huge number of Jews in Poland. Now we have to remember back then Poland was an empire, it was pretty enormous. Much of Eastern Europe was in fact Poland at the time. So a lot of scholars were trying to figure out, well, where do all these Jews come from? Suddenly you have like hundreds of thousands of Jews in Poland, and we just don't understand where they came from. So the Khazar theory was used to say, well, it was actually all of these Jews from Khazaria who came, and that's why you have the sudden population explosion. From what I understand, and again, this is not really my field, what I understand is that the rise of the population in Poland is easily explainable by all of the expulsions of the Jews in Western Europe. We have to remember that in the 14th century, you have multiple expulsions of Jews from cities and regions of what's now present-day France, what's now present-day Germany, and even moving further eastward. So many of those Jews went eastward to Poland. And then you also have Sephardic Jews who after 1492 are expelled, and they also move into the Balkans and then into, Eastern Europe. So, I mean, I think, again, the question here is really not factual. The question is polemical and ideological. And what's the motivation and interest in people claiming that these are fake Jews, etc.? Again, if these are all fake Jews, it seems very bizarre to me. I mean, the Khazars come and then they adopt rabbinic culture completely lock, stock, and barrel. I don't really get it. And then even if they did, let's say the Khazar Jews really did come, and all the Ashkenazi Jews, or 70% of them, are really from the Khazars. So what? I don't really know what that does to anyone.
Dr. Short, I don't think people realize that Judaism is a converting religion. They don't understand that. They don't understand the logics of it. But
maybe
while you're speaking, I had a eureka moment.
Oh, good. Wow. I'm honored.
During the time of the Jewish academies, and you had the Exalarchate, whatever it's called.
Yeah.
Wouldn't the communities that exist be connected to the academies and writing letters? Now, where were these descendants or these Africans where those communities before 1400, 1500 of the Common Era writing to the main offices of Jude. You see, I read this stuff and I know it. So I'm trying to figure out there is no connection, because some estimates of the population of Jews during the time of the first century said there were probably around 6 million Jews. There was a million in that region.
That's very high.
5 million. It's very high. It's controversial. But the point is, from the second century of before the Common Era, we have evidence of Jews in Europe.
Oh yeah.
I'm like, you have the Radhanite Jews that's trading. You have the Bukharan Jews. You have the Port Jews. You have all type of Jews. We are not connected to them. So I'm just trying to figure out.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, there are all these Jewish communities. There are also Jewish kingdoms in Arabia in the 7th century that we know about. Jewish princedoms. As we said, there are probably Jewish communities across North Africa. There are Jewish communities in the Caucasus, in the Caucasus Mountains, Bukhara, and there was this Khazar kingdom. Although we don't know whether and how it was connected with these Jewish communities. So you're absolutely right. And I mean, you can trace how these Persian Jewish communities eventually dwindle. And then you have the rise of the communities in Spain and Portugal. I mean, we have to remember that in the Middle Ages, before the expulsion in 1492, the demographic center of Jews was in Spain and Portugal. I mean, they weren't called Spain and Portugal then, but the Iberian Peninsula. That was numerically the center of the Jewish world. It only becomes the center of the Jewish world moves after the expulsion to Eastern Europe, again, around the 16th century. And then by, the 19th century, you have several million Jews living there. But again, Judaism is a converting religion. So there's always people coming into the Jewish world, mostly on an individual basis. Sometimes there might be whole communities that join the Jewish world, like in Africa. We didn't talk about that, but there's a whole fascinating movement now of Jewish communities springing up in Africa, and what's that about? Very fascinating. But again, even if you say like these new Jews are not related to the biblical Jews or the rabbinic Jews, it's just, I don't know. It's weird, because they've continued all of the traditions of the rabbinic Jews. So I don't know what the benefit was, what they really gained by doing that. I mean, they faked everyone out, but for what reason, I don't know.
By S.T. Goitein, The Letters of the Medieval Jewish Traders.
Exactly.
I'm going to promote. You have a few books that's been out in the recent. I'm going to actually promote them today.
Oh, thank you.
But when you talk about medieval traders, man, I'm just talking right now. I'm not asking a question. I think it's important to look at the Geniza manuscripts. You talked about Fustat earlier. And if you look at the communities where there was trading, you have letters where Jews are writing and telling their wives, you know what, I'm not coming back for now, divorce me. Or, so there's different things. There's also people donating to the main area for the Jewish community, where they're donating money, like how we would donate to a church in Africa or wherever they had a central location. People don't understand that part of the Jewish history, the parts that Babylon played and the descendants of those who actually stayed in Babylon played. Those are things they don't look into and take into consideration. Right. But let me move on. Go ahead. You wanted to add?
Let me just add to that. I mean, absolutely correct. The community, the Jewish community of Cochin in India, is another great example of a far-flung Jewish community. There was, by the way, a Jewish community in Kaifeng in China because of the Silk Road. The Jewish community of Cochin had a long-standing issue of a controversy, of a conflict between Black Jews of Cochin and white Jews, so-called white Jews of Cochin. And we know about it already in the 16th, 17th century. It probably goes back earlier than that. And the one community that was called Black was actually descendants of slaves who were freed by this one Jewish master. And that too tells you that if all of these Jewish communities were Black, then these episodes of tension with Black Jews make no sense. If all of these Jewish communities were Black, then why was Amsterdam passing ordinances against non-white Jews? If all of these Jews were black or African, why in Suriname were there all of these ordinances passed against non-white Jews? It makes no sense. And that, to me, is what you'd call kind of, negative proof that these Jews were not, all of them were not black or African. And then you have another problem, right? The theory of the Khazars completely contradicts the theory of the blackness of the Jews. You can't have it both ways. If all the Jews are really fake Khazars, then they're from the Caucasus and they're not blacks. They're whites. They're very white, in fact. I mean, the truth is they're Central Asians, but, whatever. So again, you have to really think very carefully about all these things and how they work together and what motivations people have for saying what they're saying, Yeah.
The Lawanga Jews, recently there was somebody in the African American community that claimed that he's a descendant of the Lawanga Jews and, being a slave of, so I asked Tudor Parfit, he said there's no evidence, absolutely no evidence of the Lawanga Jews being slaves, but they were traders. Can you talk about the Lawanga Jews for a minute?
I don't know anything about them. I honestly don't. I actually have to review Parfit's book in which he has a chapter about them, and I haven't gotten to it yet. Yeah, it's one of the many things I don't know about, so that's an easy one.
All right, this is a question from somebody in the audience. Groups like the Nation of Islam have written sensational books about the involvement of Jews in the slave trade. What does serious academia have to say about the participation of Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews in the slave trade?
Yeah, that's a hard question, and it's a tough question. Well, I guess those are synonyms, but anyway, yeah, it's a good question. Yes, there were clearly Sephardic Jews more than Ashkenazic Jews. There were some Ashkenazic Jews, but there were clearly Jews involved with the slave trade. If you consider the New Christians to be Jewish, then many of them were involved with the slave trade. When it comes to open Jews who are not New Christian, Sephardic Jews, again, mostly in the 16th, but mostly 17th and 18th century, who are trading Jews. Yeah, there were some, but it's just not so much. And the Nation of Islam accusations are really exaggerated and I think ill-willed. They're really mean-spirited and they're really, to my mind, false. There are probably single firms in Bristol that imported more Africans to the Americas than all of the Jews combined throughout history. Again, so I don't want to minimize it, that you also have a phenomenon where in some of the American colonies, the Jews, the Sephardic Jews mostly were involved with the internal slave trade, meaning they would buy the slaves at the ports, at the auctions, and then they would sell them upriver right into the interior to the planters. And we know about that, although unfortunately no scholars have really looked into it. I think Jewish scholars have avoided it for obvious reasons. I have not even found much evidence. But I think there's probably more there, and I wish that someone would delve into it more. So I think that the question is a different question. And by the way, there were Jews who owned plantations, but even there, numerically, it's minuscule. Suriname was the leading Jewish plantation society. The Jews in Suriname made up about a third of the so-called white population. They owned about 415 plantations at the peak in the early 18th century, maybe mid 18th century. And that was really the largest, most extensive Jewish plantation society. In Jamaica, there were some Jews who owned plantations, Barbados, Curacao, but not really. In the American South, there were really very, very few Jews who owned plantations. But Jews did definitely own slaves, and they have definitely owned them as merchants, meaning, again, they owned a handful of slaves, right? Not 100, not 200, because they weren't doing labor-intensive agriculture. So again, Jews were clearly involved with slavery. They were clearly involved with colonialism to some degree or other. They participated in it. Jews were not particularly involved with the abolitionist movement. A lot of Jewish scholars like to point to the Jewish abolitionists, but in fact, there are very few Jews who were involved in the Dutch colonial orbit, Jews were actually against abolition. In Jamaica, the Jews were against abolition. So Jews are not heroes in this story. There are exceptions. There are Jewish masters who freed their slaves, and we can talk about all the positive things, and Jews who converted their slaves and really incorporated into their family. Absolutely. On the whole, I would say Jews behaved pretty much like Christians, but I would say nowhere near as badly and nowhere near as numerically high level. And the real questions, as I hinted before, the real questions are as follows. If you look at all of the writings in the early African Atlantic that Paul Gilroy and others talk about in the 18th century, you will, and even in the 19th century, you will not find, please correct me if you know of any counterexamples, I don't think you will find a single Afro-diasporic writer who blames Jews for slave trade, or even mentions Jews when it comes to critiquing the slave trade. In Suriname, you have a lot of the Maroons, the runaway slaves, who are, very hostile for obvious reasons to the colonial Dutch authorities and even to the Jews, because the Jews were planters to a large degree in Suriname. But none of them explicitly blame the Jews, right? They blame whites. The Jews are almost like a secondary consideration. It's really in the late 19th century, and it's really, in fact, only in the early 20th century, where you have the rise of kind of Garveyite and other forms of Black nationalism, right? Influenced by people like Alexander Crumley, W.E. Blyden, and others, Briggs, what's his name? Briggs, who was the editor of The Crusader, John Bruce, the journalist, and others who, in the 1920s in particular, were starting, after the Great Migration, were starting to really think about Black identity from a much more self-confident nationalist perspective, who start to become very hostile to the Jews and start to really, using Christian theological lenses and biblical material, start to really kind of attack Jews as part of the colonial elite, part of the problem, right? But even them, if you look through all their writings in the 20s, they never, as far as I can remember, they never talk about the Jews as being responsible for the slave trade or as even being like a part of it. So as far as I can see, it's really a kind of invention from the 1980s and 1990s. And I think what has happened was, the reason the Nation of Islam picked up on it is because when you have all of these tensions in the 1980s, post-1960s tensions, economic tensions, right, between Jews and Blacks, tensions in the education system, the teachers union, etc., when there's a lot of kind of competition in the Reagan era between the different minorities because of the divide and conquer policy and strategy of the Republicans, that's when I think you have groups like the Nation of Islam picking up on all of the new research into the slave trade that was done through archival research, all of these new discoveries about the shipping registers, the ports, the registers of the ports. So now you could literally piece together the slave trade in a way you could never have done until the period of computerization and digitization. And now we know so much more about slave traders, about the slave ships, about the points of origin in Africa, et cetera, et cetera. So what I think happened was, in the tensions with the Jewish communities in the 1980s, they made use of all of this new information about the slave trade and wielded it as a weapon against the Jews. Frankly, I find it very bizarre. I mean, I think it comes from the fact that the Nation of Islam is, and I don't want to generalize. I know the Nation of Islam is a mixed, variegated, complex community and phenomenon. My personal belief is that Louis Farrakhan is pretty anti-Semitic. He's entitled to his views. I understand, the hostility to colonizers and enslavers and so on. But I do think he has a particular axe to grind against the Jews. And it's weird to me why they would seek to blame the Jews so much, because honestly, and I don't just say this as a Jew, it seems so obvious to me. Anyone who knows anything about the history of Atlantic slavery and the Atlantic slave trade, it just seems patently obvious to me that the overwhelming majority of those instigating it, carrying it out, justifying it, were Christians. I mean, I don't know if they were religious Christians or not, but they were Christian. So why? What do you gain by blaming the Jews? And again, to me, it's an anti-Semitic trope, and it's weird because blaming the Jews lets all the Christians off the hook. Now, so I don't know. So I don't quite get it really. It's convenient to blame the Jews, and the Jews all have made a scapegoat persistently in European history. Christianity is very ambivalent, very almost schizophrenic when it comes to Jews, loving them, hating them, holding them up, and then knocking them down. So I don't quite explain it. I do think, frankly, that there's a kind of, and there is a scholar who wrote a wonderful essay about the Nation of Islam, who does a kind of psychoanalytic study of the Nation of Islam, and he reads it as a kind of toxic masculinity, a kind of competitive masculinity, where they have a need to knock down the Jews, maybe because there's a sense that they see themselves as Jews, or they envy the Jews. I don't really know.
Okay.
I hope that's helpful.
What contact, and this is a question because out of ignorance, but I want you to answer it anyway. What contact did Sephardic Jews have with West African? Does academia treat both groups as being the same?
Academia definitely does not treat both groups as being the same. I think now you have actually an incredible rise in research, amazing research that's being done on West Africa and Jews or new Christians in West Africa by people like Tobias Green. I don't know if he's one of your 20 scholars, but he definitely should be. He has written a number of great books on the new Christians in West Africa, particularly around Cabo Verde. And really, he's the one who gets into a lot of the details using Inquisition records, among other things. And there's some great scholars now who've, over the last 20 or 30 years, started to use African materials, right, archival materials, to piece together a lot of this story. So the new Christians, when the Portuguese come around the coast of West Africa, the bump of West Africa, starting in the 1440s, more or less, the new Christians are very involved. The new Christians, a lot of the new Christians, again, set themselves up in West Africa as merchants. Some of them even move there. In the 17th century or the late 16th century, you have these three small Jewish communities in Rufisque, Joal, and I forget the third community in what's now Senegal, or the Senegambia region. And so the contact there is mostly commercial. They're there to do trade, including with slaves, including in slaves. Many of them become locals. Many of them, one of the whole issues with the Lançados and the Luso-Africans is that from the Portuguese perspective, they go native, right? That's one of the things they are aghast, they're horrified that all these Portuguese have come to West Africa and then they quote unquote go native, right? They marry local women. Some of them start taking up local customs and practices, right? From the Portuguese position, superstitions and fetishes, right? And that's why the Inquisition comes to Africa, actually, is because you have all these Portuguese who are suddenly doing all this deviant stuff, and heretic Christian stuff that's heretical from the Christian perspective. And by the way, that's another point of contact between the two, because the Inquisition, like so many of these Christians, often confuses and conflates the heretical evil Jewish practices with heretical evil African practices. And it's very hard to distinguish them sometimes in the source material, because, for instance, we know obviously that there were many African peoples that performed circumcision, right? And so sometimes you have these Christian writers, missionaries among others, who say, aha, well, we see in Angola, for instance, we see this people circumcising, they must be Jews.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm like, no, hello, they circumcise because that's a very widespread practice in many cultures in the world, including in Africa. So it doesn't mean they're Jews. The whole issue with Sao Tome, St. Thomas, right, where the Portuguese conquered it, and it was one of the first laboratories for the sugar agriculture, industrial agriculture. And in fact, the Portuguese king he kidnapped all of these Jewish young Jews in Portugal, and he kidnapped, is what I'm calling it. He pressed them into service, is what they would call it, and he sent them forcibly to Sao Tome, about 2,000 Jewish teenagers, and he forced them to kind of settle and colonize this island for the Portuguese. And I suspect, based on the work of other scholars, that the reason he did that was because he thought that they would have a better chance of surviving all of the tropical diseases. So there you have, again, lots of mixture with the local population. You have the rise of a whole population of sort of mixed race mulattoes, as you do in Cape Verde. Many of them are new Christians. There's a lot of claims by scholars that this, and I'm sorry to keep using these racialist terms like mulatto. I don't know if it sounds better than mixed race or worse, but it's just a shorthand. So please do forgive me. So there's a lot of speculation from scholars that these groups of mulatto Cabo Verdeans or Sao Tomeans practiced Jewish practices, kept the Jewish religion. I'm very skeptical about it. I really don't know. I don't trust the Inquisition, because the Inquisition had an axe to grind, obviously, against Jews, and was looking to find Jews everywhere. So I just don't know if the claims of Jewish practices were just another way of attacking these mixed race groups and knocking down their status so that they wouldn't be seen as equal to whites. So those are mostly the contacts. Now, again, it's all very messy and weird, and oppression, exploitation, I'm sorry to say, is often an equal opportunity employer. So we have to keep in mind that these new Christians were often trading African slaves in conjunction with local Africans who were selling other groups, other peoples, other tribes. Yes, the wars were instigated by the Europeans, often by the Portuguese. But again, it's really a whole big mess. So now again, some scholars say that a lot of these new Christians or Jews conveyed their Judaism and Jewishness to some of the local Africans, and why not? That seems totally plausible to me. We know that in these very small Jewish communities on the West African coast in the 17th century, it does seem that local Africans converted, that local Africans were incorporated into the communities. How many that means, whether it was 50 of them or 500 of them, I have no idea. I sort of doubt it was on the 500 side. I think these were very small numbers we're talking about. But yes, these are fascinating phenomena. So I always try to keep an open mind about these contacts. So hopefully there too, that makes some sense of that topic.
Okay. In your book, Jews and Blacks in the Modern World, on pages 166 and 167, you talk about Jews assimilating into the dominant culture as white. Could you explain this concept to my audience?
Yes. Again, I think that Jews, it is not clear. Are you still there, Garfield? Well, hopefully I'm still there, so I'll keep talking. I'm here. Okay, good. So again, I argue that Jews themselves, the Sephardic Jews in particular, did not necessarily consider themselves white. Whiteness at the time was, as I said before, a kind of flexible, polemical category, right? We know that in Mexico, in parts of the Americas, people could buy certificates of whiteness, right, to prove that they were parts of the highest class. So whiteness really, we have to keep in mind, it wasn't a totally hollow or empty category, but it was pretty pliable, pretty flexible. So I think most Jews did not necessarily see themselves as white. I think they wanted to see themselves as white increasingly as the 17th century goes on, precisely because whiteness was becoming increasingly important, especially in the colonies. So what I argue is Jews are increasingly positioning themselves as white. They're using the language of whiteness. They are insisting that they are worthy to be in the dominant majority, that they are equal to or worthy to be partners, as it were, with, let's say, colonizing whites, whether it's the Dutch, the English, the French, or the Danish, or what have you. So that's what I mean by assimilating into whiteness. They're starting to think according to white categories. They're starting to act like whites. They're doing things like in the 18th century and even in the 17th century, they're buying up estates, landed estates in Holland or in England. They're starting to act like kind of petty nobility. So I feel like they take on the attributes of whiteness, white behavior, white attitudes, and then certainly, most obviously, when it comes to slavery, when it comes to slaves, they take on these attributes of whiteness. They tend to be, although again we can find exceptions, but they tend to be fairly negative about Africans. They tend to be negative against slaves. They tend to pass a lot of legislation that keeps non-white Jews out of full participation in the Jewish community. They don't want people, the elites that is, who are mostly in the merchant class, they don't want the white Jews to intermarry with the former slaves or have children with the slaves. So to me, those are all attributes of whiteness. And again, when it comes to abolition, for instance, in Jamaica, we have very well known hostility where the Jews don't want the free people of color to be given rights and voting rights and privileges. Why? Because that would put them on an equal status with Jews. So you have all kinds of, ethnic or racial positioning against other groups. And so it's in that context that I argue from the 16th century, but mostly from the 17th century onward, including, by the way, into the 20th century, that Jews, in a very different context, obviously, that Jews are assimilating into whiteness.
Okay, all right. Let me get this question here. We get the audience getting involved.
Which, sorry, by the way, if you'll allow me to just continue, but when you see, as you brought up sort of the Nazi period, you see that in the 19th and 20th century all the time in a completely different context. In Europe, you have Jews all over the place who write and talk explicitly. Even in art and painting, you can see Jews are very self-conscious about how they look. Jews have black curly hair. They have different kind of noses. They have different kind of faces. Jewish bodies are seen to be flabby. Jewish men are not seen as masculine and strong and athletic. So there's a real self-consciousness that's very parallel, very similar to black self-consciousness about how the black body is portrayed by whites and by whiteness. And so it's a very similar, and in certain ways, it's a very similar process, and in some ways it actually combines and coalesces. So there too you have Jews. There's a very famous short story I'm thinking about by a Jewish writer in Germany in the 1920s who writes about this Jewish guy who's about to marry this high-class German woman, and there's an engagement party and they're getting drunk, and in one step after another, the Jews, this Jewish man's sort of costume becomes undone, and his hair comes out, right, and it's all curly and crazy, and he's drunk, so he starts speaking with his low Yiddish accent, and by the end of the story, everyone there is horrified because the inner Jew has emerged, and of course he's driven out of town and the wedding is off. And that's a typical example of how the Jewish self-consciousness is also physical and somatic, not just theological and not just cultural. So, yeah.
We're going to end in 23 minutes, but I have to get this question out the way real quickly. You know, we're searching for people who may be Black Jews, light-skinned Jews, Mediterranean Jews, all over the world. What kind of Jews? But one thing, though, there's a brother by the name of Brother Reggie Marbury in the community. You know, he's a veteran. And he wants me to ask a question. But before I ask his question, I have to ask this question. Does any Jewish community we find from 2nd century, from Judah, Hanasi, to all the way up to the slave trade, let's use the 1500s. Do we find any community that's following Judaism believing in the New Testament?
Well, you'd have to, I mean, I'm glad you said the 2nd century, because that is close to the cutoff point. I mean, obviously you have the earliest Christian communities, which are Jewish, basically. Right. I mean, Antioch, I mean, the earliest, among others, but the earliest the earliest communities that become Christ followers, while Paul is circulating and missionizing, these are Jewish communities. So until the 3rd, 4th century, maybe even later, but you have some of these Jewish communities that become followers of Christ, that start to believe in what becomes officially Christianity, after all of the councils and the Roman Empire. Constantine declares the Roman Empire, Christian officially. But after that, meaning like once you get out of early Christianity, I can't think of any example. But you have sort of interesting symbiotic or syncretistic examples. So, for instance, the early Ethiopian community, we don't know. There's a lot of scholarly debate about whether they were Christian originally and then took on Judaism in order to distinguish themselves from the kings and the monarchic Christianity. This is really not my area of expertise, so I'm just putting out what I can remember from what I've studied and read myself. There are, of course, theories that they descend from Menelik and who was born to the Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. But I think a lot of scholars think that the Jewish Ethiopian community was originally Christian and then increasingly became, because Ethiopian Christianity was so Old Testament oriented in its beginnings, became increasingly Jewish, and that they only declared themselves Jewish quite late, actually, under King Todros. Again, I really don't remember the Ethiopian medieval history, so I'll leave it at that. And then you also have, obviously, very interesting, once Protestantism arises, you have some very interesting, radical Protestant groups that take on a lot of Jewish practices, that take on Sabbath on Saturday, or take on even keeping kosher. But that's completely separate. So, I may be missing something, but I can't really think of.
The reason I asked, because you brought up Pentecostalism, right? Mm-hmm. And if you look at, because they concentrate so much on the Old Testament and how they are, Pentecostals are, it makes a lot of sense why they would push towards Judaism. Right. Now, if the slaves or if the Jews in the medieval time period, black, white, red, or yellow, weren't into that, it shows a connection that the folks are descended who are Jewish, or who converted folks are connected to a strong Judaism background. Right. They're not connected to a New Testament background, which African Americans claim the New Testament. So if you are a Jew by ancestry, we don't see the tradition of Jews knowing anything about the New Testament, or following it, I should say.
Right. The first examples of that kind of African or African American New Testament Judaism or Jewishness is the early 20th century, or the late 19th century. What I was telling you about, the commandment keepers of Harlem and the various syncretistic, groups of Hebrew Israelite Jews in the 1920s and a little earlier. Earlier than that, right? You're either converted by Jews who are Jewish, or you're Christian, or you take on Christianity as an enslaved person. I don't really see the mixing of the two. But obviously, as we know, there's mixing of some of the rhetoric. Obviously, the slaves, a lot of the enslaved groups of Christians love talking about Moses, love talking about the Exodus from Egypt for very obvious reasons. But that doesn't mean they were Jewish,
Let me see. I got about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to 7 questions left.
All right. I'll try to be quick.
All right, let's see. All right, there are some sensationalists from my community who have invented crazy theories about Sephardic Jews. One theory is that there were 2 types of Sephardic. One black, like me, who are claimed to be the original. The other European, who migrated to the Iberian Peninsula and were mass converted by these black Sephardic Jews. Could you address those incredible claims for me?
Okay, I'm not even sure I follow it. I never heard anything like that before. I don't know what evidence there is for it. And again, even if, say it's true, where would you see, what are the consequences of that? I mean, let's say it's true. What would it prove? Because it would have to prove that even the original black Jews were the fully Jewish ones. So I don't know. I just don't get it. I don't get what one gains from that. What does that do for you?
All right. Let me see, what is this one? Okay, there are some from my community, this is from the same person asking the question, who say that the original Sephardic Jews who lived in the United States during the colonial period in the 1700s, such as in Savannah, Georgia, were all literally black men and women. They also claim that paintings are artwork of Sephardic Jews from the same period that do not resemble folks like me were supposedly invented after the fact. Could you dispel those rumors, please?
I mean, look, again, I just don't understand what one gains from holding that theory. First of all, if you can find any evidence that those paintings were later forgeries or whatever, great. So show me the evidence. I'll consider it if you can show me any evidence. Never heard it before in my life, by the way. But if those original Jews in Savannah, and by the way, yes, I mean, you could argue that the whole first Jewish phase of life in the United States up until like 1740, maybe even a little later, was entirely Sephardic in New Amsterdam, in New York, in Boston a little bit, but also in Savannah and Philadelphia. If they're all black, then what do you make of the fact that they were the ones holding the slaves? And the fact that they weren't manumitting the slaves that they held, that they were often bequeathing them to their own children. I just did a whole bunch of research into the family of Louis Moses Gomez in colonial New York. He dies in 1740. I mean, if they're all black, then it's even weirder. So it's just, again, you have to, if you're proposing one theory, I would think that you'd have to figure out how you harmonize it with other theories. So, yeah, I mean, you can't have it both ways. If they're all the slave masters and the slave traders and the evil white colonialists and enslavers, how could they all be blacks? You can't have it both ways. I mean,
exactly. There's another Sephardic Ashkenazi. This is the last one. Sephardic, there's some in the community who identify as Hebrew Israelites who try to claim that they're the real Jews, and Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews have stolen their identity. As a serious scholar who has written extensively on the history of the Jews, what can you say to my audience about these outlandish claims?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that these claims are so attractive and powerful. I can understand why wanting to be the chosen people, or I can understand why wanting to be somehow the real descendants of the biblical Israelites is very powerful and attractive, but I don't know. I mean, it's just biology, and I'm not really sure what biology asks you. Like, okay, so if you really descended from the biblical Israelites 2,000 years later, does that really make anything particular of you? No, I mean, what makes something of you is your identity, your culture, your values, what your behavior, what you do in the world. But look, again, if it's true that all the real Jews were the black Jews throughout these millennia, for 2,000, for 3,000 years, then I just don't understand why there's no evidence, as far as I can see. Where is the evidence of them putting forth black Hebrew Israelite values or propaganda, not propaganda, but priorities or ideology? I mean, I just don't see anywhere in 2,000 years of Jewish history that people are talking about, Kemet returning to Egypt, returning to Africa. They're not talking about Jewish Africanness. They're not talking about Jewish blackness, except in the small ways that I've been talking about, which are so narrow and so specific to colonialism and slavery in the 17th and 18th centuries. So it's just bizarre, because you would think that somewhere you would find some examples of this. So, to my mind, the Israelites in the Bibles, they weren't white and they weren't black. They were some Middle Eastern people. Who cares what their skin color was? I mean, their values, their behavior, their culture was all totally Middle Eastern. Judaism and Jewishness changes over time, and the values and the culture and the specifics of it is very different, whether you're talking about Persia, whether you're talking about Italy, whether you're talking about Ukraine, whether you're talking about Yemen, whether you're talking about the state of Israel now, post-1948. So again, I feel like these essentialists, these essentializing ideas that we have to prove that we're descended from some ancient people, just are kind of beside the point. I don't really get why they're so important,
All right. I got 4 more questions. Mr. Schorsch,
Okay.
regarding the Jews of Amsterdam, were these the same Sephardic Jews expelled during the Inquisition? First question. And what relationship did they have with Africans? Why were they hesitant to convert African slaves?
Right. Okay. So good question. So the Spanish Jews were expelled in 1492 from Spain. They fled wherever they could. Many of them fled to Italy. Many of them fled to North Africa. Many of them fled eastward to the Ottoman Empire. Eventually, a lot of them end up in the Netherlands, in Antwerp, and then in the Netherlands. So they are descendants of the expelled Jews. Many of Judaism is officially permitted in the Netherlands at the very beginning of the 17th century. I want to say 1619, 1605, somewhere around there. Jews are now allowed to be open Jews and have a synagogue, because before that they were new Christians. They were people descended from Jews who had been converted, or who had converted, or their ancestors had converted back in Spain and Portugal. And now their descendants fled. Somehow they managed to escape from the Inquisition, escape from the Iberian Peninsula. They get to, let's say, the Netherlands, and they come out as Jews, because until now they had to keep it secret. So now they're living in the Netherlands. Now a lot of what one scholar calls new Jews come to the Netherlands, new Christians, Marranos, and they come, some of them to be Jews, some of them just because they're of Jewish background, some of them just because it's better economically. Many of them are fleeing from the Inquisition. Once they're in the Netherlands, that's where the Sephardic community, there's 3 synagogues that merged in 1639, when there are some communal laws passed before that, but there are many laws passed after that, after 1639. And it's there in Amsterdam that you have some of these laws targeting non-white Jews. Why? Because many of these new Christians and Jews in Amsterdam have lived in West Africa. They've lived in West Africa, they've traded in West Africa, and then they leave, they come to the Netherlands, and then you have them bringing either their slaves There's one example I recall of someone, a wealthy Jewish merchant, who had converted one of his interpreters, one of his translators, right, who was translating the local African languages for him. And so now you have a number, again, we don't know the exact number, but a number of non-white Jews, mixed race, mulattoes, whatever we want to call them, who are living in Amsterdam among the Jewish community. Some of them are Jews, totally Jewish, legally Jewish. Some of them are not. But let's say there are, in the early 1620s, 1630s, let's say there are 20 of them. Maybe in the 1640s or 1670s, there are 50 of them, although I think those numbers are high. But let's say that's what the numbers are. So they're a visible presence. And again, as I'm saying, the Sephardic community there in Amsterdam is now extremely self-conscious about Jewish otherness. They're extremely self-conscious that they themselves are not fully white and look different and behave differently, and they want to fit in. So now they're double self-conscious that there are all these non-whites in the community. And I think they kind of come down on the non-whites because they themselves want so much to be seen as white. Now, I do have to mention this other example that I mentioned to you, Garfield, when we were speaking the other week, of Moses de Mesquita, who was one of these children of a Jewish Portuguese man and an African woman, who I think their relationship started in Portugal, but then he went to West Africa. Probably he went to the place where her family was from, where she came from. He was a merchant there for many years, or some years, and then he came to Amsterdam. Again, keep in mind, he's a mulatto, right, a mixed white, black. He actually rises up to become one of the leaders of the community, which is about as high as anyone can go. And yet, as a leader of the community, even though he's mixed race, he signs one of the ordinances that forbids non-whites who are not fully legally Jewish from being buried in the Jewish cemetery. So he's a great example of this kind of partial insiderness, where sure, you can find some mixed race people, some non-white or partially white Jews who become part of the community. And in this case, he even rises up fairly high. He's obviously wealthy. He's a community leader. And yet he's also siding against non-whites who aren't fully legally Jewish. So in a way, he's saying, well, I made it. I'm an insider. But if you don't follow the rules of Jewishness, the Jewish rules of Jewishness, then you can't play the game. So again, nothing to me as fascinating as history.
All right. In your book, certain Jews such as Hester Levi, daughter of Moses Levi, and the big rabbi of the London synagogue are called black, seemingly in relation to their hair. Is there any correlation between the use of black referring to hair and eye colors as an identifier of complexion rather than skin tone?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's what I think it means. I don't think it only strictly means skin color. I think it means, yes, they seem black in the way that we talk about Africans. I'm not sure, and this is where I think we have to be careful when reading these sources. I'm not sure if it means for these authors who use the term that they see these Jews as Negroid, but it could. It could mean something like that. They have frizzy hair, they're dark, they have dark eyes, etc. But yeah, it's hard to know exactly what they mean. There are many examples, though, of sources that link Jews and blacks, meaning that they use Jews and blacks together to sort of connect them as being, again, less than white, as being somehow problematic, somehow lower. And there the polemic is obvious, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with skin color. So as I said, right, there are many medieval and early modern expressions by Christian authors where they'll say, the Jews are so stubborn, they'll never accept Christ. And it's as their stubbornness is as deeply ingrained to them as blackness is to an Ethiopian. So you see a lot of those kinds of statements, that both Jews and blackness, that both Jews and Africans or sub-Saharan Africans or blacks, they're both characterized by some kind of innate blindness or indelible curse almost, or stain, So yeah, a very, very good question.
In Maurice Fishberg's book, I have it shared, by the way, Jews,
Yeah,
A Study of Race and Environment, on page
right.
17. He shows images of Negroid Jews,
Exactly.
light skin, thick lips, and dark hair. Could this be perhaps what writers be referring to in regards to Jews either being or appearing black?
Right. So listen, I mean, first of all, this author is a great example of a Jew who takes up racialist theories, right? He's a Jew who is fond of theories that come from the master class, right? The white German, thinkers, and he's making use of them. He's internalized them. So to me, he's a terrible example of a bad use of science, a bad Jewish use of science. Yes, obviously this is much later, and that's, again, I think, as when we're talking about history, we have to be very careful. You cannot just assume that all of these things are the same. The 16th century is not the 19th century, is not the 4th century. The way people think are different, the cultures are different, etc. But wait, if you just go back up to that slide, which is a great slide, you can see that, yes, obviously, you can see the faces there, and some of the faces look more like what we might say, let's say an East African might look like, a Semitic, a kind of Somalian or Ethiopian East African nose might look like. Again, I even hate talking in these terms, but fine. There are different faces and different physiologies and physiognomies. Excuse me. Obviously, I don't think it means anything racist or racialist, right? There are simply all kinds of beautifully different human families, right? The problem with these theories is that they say it means that you're on a lower level, right? But even if you look at those faces, sure, Jews look different from one another. Jews look different from white Europeans. Jews generally don't have blue eyes. Jews generally don't have, aquiline Roman noses. Jews generally don't have blonde hair. There are many, many exceptions, right? Because again, one, there was a lot of intermarriage, despite Jewish myths that Jews never intermarried. There was a lot of intermarriage. And two, a lot of Jewish women were raped over the centuries repeatedly, over and over again. Not each woman, thank God, although who knows. But so there you have new blood coming in. So it's not like a mystery where the mixtures are coming from. Now, again, keep in mind, Sephardic Jews were Mediterranean. The Portuguese Jews in particular intermarried with sub-Saharan Africans. So the fact that you have all kinds of different looking Jews only tells you what you know. Factually, biologically, the question, once again, that I always have to insist on coming back to is, what difference does the difference make? What are you raising it for? What are you trying to say when you raise it? And what are the consequences of it? And so when Fishberg uses these things to talk about Negroid Jews, I mean, he's trying to make a certain point in the 19th century, early 20th century. And I don't think it proves that Jews are Negroid. It might prove that some Jews had African blood and some Jews had black heritage, but I don't think anyone denies that. I don't think that's really the question. And by the way, I wanted to say that even Du Bois, when Du Bois goes on his trip to Poland, he makes a trip to Poland and he himself notices how dark the Jews are. And he sees quickly that they look different than the Poles. They're darker. And he notices it in his diary. But he doesn't draw the leap that makes them black or sub-Saharan African. He understands that the Jews, even though numerically they're often the minority in Poland and in Eastern Europe, often numerically the majority in many towns and places, but culturally and politically they're completely dominated. So he sees the parallelism with blackness in the Americas, but it doesn't confuse him into thinking that Jews are Africans and black in that identity sense.
Dr. Schorsch, when can we do a part 2?
Oh, please, anytime. I'd love it. I really appreciate your questions. I appreciate your listening, and I do hope this has been helpful. I know that I often can ramble and
No,
lead
no,
from
the
one thing
rambling is
to
good.
another.
The rambling is good. I
Okay.
do think you have answered a lot of questions. You have helped me to look into certain things with your answers. But I do want to, let me ask you this one last question. The Jews of Ethiopia, can you talk about that for a little bit? You talked about it earlier, and we're not sure because there's just so many different perspectives, even with the Yemenite Jews, how they were converted. One of the traditions said that 2 Jews came from Israel and converted them. We don't know. We weren't there. But what do you, well, you know what, that's not even your expertise anyway. Maybe I should even ask this.
Yeah,
But
I
what do
mean,
you think about the
I can
Ethiopian Jews?
I can tell you other people who know the story much better than I do. Obviously, if you talked to Tudor Parfit already, I assume you talked about the Lemba, which is another amazing story, and doesn't surprise me at all. The Ethiopian Jews, I think what's interesting for me in this context about the Ethiopian Jews is they existed for centuries. They had no connection with the rest of the Jewish world. I mean, literally no connection. We hear about them in trickles in the 16th, 17th century, maybe the 15th century. So the other Jews are aware of them, and they're kind of this lost 10 tribe myth. And then over time, they become connected with the Jewish community, but it's quite late. It's really the 19th century. And then you have these Ashkenazic Jews, these Western Jews who go there to discover, the Ethiopian Jews,
Right.
and become aware of them. And they actually have some of these travelers treat them in very colonialist, very Orientalist ways. I'm sorry to say, but not surprising there too. And the Ethiopian Jews are seen as a kind of, in the 19th century, they're seen as an example of these exotic Jews out there somewhere who need to be saved, who need to be rescued by the advanced modern white Jews, the Western Jews, right? Sound familiar? So you have a lot of this kind of like attitude of, on the one hand, we're proud that they're Jews because it's kind of cool, right? They're exotic. They make us look good, right? They show in a way that we come from also like unique non-Western backgrounds. We were warriors, we were farmers, we were rooted in the land, whatever. And then at the same time, there are also ways that these Jews are seen by other Jews as primitive, as background, as needing to be rescued, as needing to be taught what Judaism is. So the entree of the Ethiopian Jews into the mainstream Jewish communities throughout the 19th and 20th centuries was pretty mixed. And it's not all, it's a lot of it's pretty harsh and negative, different Ethiopian Jews who were invited to go study in, let's say, in Israel or Palestine at the time, Ethiopian Jews who were invited to come tour the United States to raise money for supplies and prayer books and things for the Ethiopian Jews. And a lot of them were not treated very well, and there were a lot of cultural and racial differences. And then, of course, needless to say, when the Ethiopian Jews were finally brought en masse to the land of Israel, right, in the 1980s, horrible racism. They were greeted with horrible racism, very tragic. I think things are getting better. When I have spent time in Israel, I must say I love seeing Ethiopian Jews. It's a very beautiful thing to see. It really warms my heart. And I love that Jews have who have Jews that look like different Jews around. It's so good for us.
Let me ask you this. One of the things that Tudor Parfit wrote about is that they didn't know any Hebrew.
They did not know Hebrew,
which is very troubling. If you're isolated, you didn't know Hebrew at all, and that was. But in the first, and I mean, when you look at the Aksumite Empire, you could tell they had signs on their coins of which gods they believed in, and we noticed the cross came along when Izana came in. So we see the Bible entering. Not that they didn't know the Bible, because they had kings who were interacting in trade. And of course, people keep forgetting, and I have to drive this point home. Judaism is a converting religion, meaning that a lot of traders happen to be Port Jews who were traders.
Right.
So, how it got to Ethiopia is a whole nother conversation, but I'm going to leave that point here. and I'm going to call you this evening or call you this afternoon, and we're going to set up a part 2 because we really, and I want to get the audience more involved where they could ask questions and so forth. There's a question
Sure.
my brother Reggie I got to ask, but I have to go pick up my son. So I have to get,
Okay.
I'm late. I got to get out of here.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. I'll reach
Thank
out to you soon, probably later this afternoon, and we set up a part 2. But
All right.
thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule, and enjoy your evening. All right.
I thank you. I'm honored. I am delighted. I really thank you for your questions. And I'm willing to give so much time for one reason also, which is that it's a super important topic. Jews and blacks should be getting along. Blacks and blacks, Jews and Jews, everyone should be getting along. So if history and knowledge of history can help that, it's worth it. So again, thanks, and I look forward to talking more. It's been a real pleasure.
And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, I might convert soon. You never know. All right. Peace and love.
All right. We'll talk more about it. Take care.